hard to think of an industry that yields more influence than that of big oil. In fact, Bush's former speechwriter just came out and admitted that oil was a major motivating factor for the invasion of Iraq. I know, hardly a shocker there. But while oil may be an influential feature of U.S. foreign policy, the fossil fuel industry also enormously impacts domestic policy and the media narrative. It's a subject my next guest has tackled throughout his entire career, while exposing some of the biggest oil corporations from the U.S. to Venezuela and everywhere in between. He's a close friend of late Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, investigative journalist and author of many books, including the last one, Billionaires and Ballot Bandits, How to Steal an Election in 9 Easy Steps. Greg Palast, thanks so much for joining me.
Glad to be here, Abby.
So you spent a lot of time with Hugo Chavez. When he died, he was vilified by the U.S. government and the media alike. But as you've pointed out, this wasn't always the case. So what was the turning point for when he evolved into U.S. public enemy #1?
Well, shock, it's the oil. Chavez back in 2000 to 2001 decided that he wasn't going to give it away anymore. Oil had been selling for about $15 a barrel. When it went up, he said, you're going to have to pay for it. The big U.S. oil companies are paying a royalty for Venezuela's super heavy oil of about 1%. 1%, okay? And for the regular oil, the heavy oil, was 16%. So the oil companies are keeping 84%, and Chavez said, you're going to have to pay 30%. You can only keep 70% of our oil, which is now $100 a barrel, right? You can only keep $70 a barrel. You got to split off a bit to the people of Venezuela. And of course, that made him enemy #1, not to Americans, but to America's landlords, the oil companies.
And, you know, as we know already about the economic hitman's role and the jackals and how kind of the world is structured in that sense and the corporatocracy in which we live, I mean, Chavez once asked you why the U.S. elite wanted him dead, why they wanted to kill him. Did he believe that the U.S. was trying to actively assassinate him for a while?
Actually, they did, and I was a BBC reporter, I am a BBC reporter, covering Chavez, and we had a lot of inside information on the various assassination attempts. And the U.S. Obviously supported the coup d'etat. The president of Venezuela, Chavez, who was elected, was kidnapped by the Chamber of Commerce chief, a guy named Carmona. Talk about a corporate takeover, a violent corporate takeover, and he was released. But the U.S. ambassador came down and had his photo taken with the guys who had kidnapped the president of Venezuela. So you can imagine how that played in Venezuela. Yeah, so the U.S. was continually trying to kill him. And in fact, Chavez sent to my office in New York his vice president, Nicolas Maduro, who is now running to take Chavez's place as president, he's acting president, to go over the evidence that they had and share with me and the BBC team the evidence we had about endless attempts to get rid of Chavez. They thought a bullet would reduce their taxes. That's one way to take a tax cut.
And of course, in the wake of his death, Greg, we're seeing think tanks going crazy. I mean, just recently, the American Enterprise Institute drafted a post-Chavez checklist for American policymakers recommending the U.S. to move quickly to reorganize the country. I mean, in your perspective, what are U.S. interests doing to seize upon Venezuela in the wake of his death?
Well, think of it this way. You had Pat Robertson, the televangelist, who is, I know him, and he said, you know, I'm a businessman. He's deeply involved in Venezuelan investments. He's a billionaire. And he said, you know, Hugo Chavez thinks they're trying to assassinate him, and I think we should just go ahead and do it. You just send out a team of commandos, cheaper than a $200 billion war. Because as far as Pat Robertson and his buck buddies, the Koch brothers, Exxon, Chevron, etc., the Venezuelans are sitting on their oil. It's not Venezuela's oil, and that's the ultimate concern. Is that Venezuela now has 5 times the reserve of Saudi Arabia. If you look at the U.S. Energy Department, tags Venezuela as the largest oil state on the planet, and of course, what are the Venezuelans doing on our oil?
Yeah, I like the connection that you made between the Koch brothers, Venezuela, and the Keystone Pipeline, of course. But Greg, people defended the Koch brothers to me. They said that they're great free market capitalists who are pushing for causes that are for civil liberties, that are against the drug war. Can you break down why it's so dangerous to have two billionaires influencing and shaping so much of the future of this country?
Well, because we'll choke to death and we'll drown. That is, the Koch brothers are the impetus behind the XL pipeline. It's true that they are correctly denied that they have no direct ownership of the pipeline or its oil. But why is the oil going all the way from Canada, all the way down to Houston? Why are we taking oil from Canada to Houston? After all, Texas has some oil. The answer is that the Koch brothers refinery is at the end of the XL pipeline, the Flint Hills refinery. That's where most of the oil will end up. Right now, they have to buy their oil from Venezuela, the heavy oil that Hugo Chavez's government produced. And Chavez wouldn't give it away. The Venezuelan oil costs about $101 a barrel. It's $33 a barrel cheaper to bring in that glop, that melted liquid, filthy crud asphalt that would come down from melting the Canadian tar sands through the XL pipeline. The only reason America is facing a 2,000-mile toxic slash across its belly is so that the Koch brothers can save 33 bucks a barrel, and it adds up. It's about $2 billion plus a year for them to have the XL pipeline bring in the crud from Canada rather than the much, much less polluting oil from Venezuela. Venezuelan oil has about 1/5 of the sulfur of the Canadian tar sands. So we would be burning up this planet. In fact, if all that tar sands oil comes down to the Koch refinery, they'll save $2 billion a year. But the planet temperature, the entire planet's temperature will rise by about 1 degree Fahrenheit. And if you're a scientist, it's not just 1 degree like you put on some suntan oil. One degree Fahrenheit for the average temperature of the planet means absolute devastation and drowning for hundreds of thousands.
But the Koch brothers are going to save money, Greg. That's most important here. You know, the Keystone Pipeline is really going to be a hideous scar across this country, and I really hope that we can stop it. I mean, it looks like Obama's going to go ahead and sign off on that. But I wanted to shift focus, since we have a couple minutes left, to what's going on in Myanmar. On Twitter,
Yes.
you posted an article about the country being a, quote, promised land for oil and gas giants. How is this playing a role into the sectarian violence? Does it at all? And it seems, really quickly, it seems that we also go into countries for humanitarian reasons when we're interested in their natural resources. Do you think that we're going to be seeing more about this country now that oil interests are vying for a piece of the pie?
Well, it's amazing how much more sympathy the U.S. State Department has for a nation when they're sitting on a bunch of oil, okay, unless they don't give it up. So the whole point of cutting a deal with after all, it's still under the control of a military junta, besides whether they have a Nobel Peace Prize winner they're allowed in the government or not. The problem we have right now is that that there's a Muslim minority on the border, and you're not going to be able to pull out the oil unless you kind of move them. And so there's basically new ethnic cleansing going on, and we have not had the United States government, which was so concerned about human rights in Burma, Myanmar. Suddenly, why don't we have a concern about the people that are being pushed off their lands? It's called an ethnic conflict, but it's never an ethnic conflict. There's been an ethnic conflict forever. It's a resource conflict, and I'm very concerned that once again we are displacing people and effectively turning a blind eye to genocide. It's not ethnic. It is a resource issue. It is about and as usual, it's about grabbing the oil and the pipeline routes.
Unbelievable. And Greg, we have about a minute left, but to those who are watching this and saying it's hopeless, what can we do to take our country back and the world at large from these corporate overlords? What would you say?
Well, tell the truth on them. I mean, most people don't even understand the connection between the XL pipeline and the Koch brothers and the war against Hugo Chavez. It's all one battle. And by the way, that's why I've agreed with BBC to allow people to take the film, The Assassination of Hugo Chavez, my film for BBC, for free. If you go to gregpalast.com, at least you'll know what they're doing to you. I mean, that's the first thing. You can't stop the pickpocket unless you find their hand in your pocket. You got to grab them by the wrist. So the information is first, and that's why I appreciate RT letting me on.
Thank you so much, Greg Palast, investigative reporter. Indeed, awareness comes first before we can ultimately make the change. Always awesome to have you, Greg.